Okay, hey everybody, thanks for joining us. This is Raza Lawrence and Allison Margolin and Jeremy Salvador, and we're going to be talking about some of the changes to the practice of law due to the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the interesting issues that have been coming up. There's obviously a lot of changes in our society due to the coronavirus. Things have changed very rapidly, but we still have the rule of law. The courts are still operating. There's no martial law yet, which would be where the military takes over for the judicial system. And we have a lot of opportunities for lawyers in this pandemic. It's creating a lot of new problems to solve. A lot of people are having disputes over financial issues, with a lot of people losing lots of money left and right and trying to figure out how to cover it. There's also all kinds of questions about what happens to individual rights and our normal constitutional rights during this outbreak, and to what extent can the government take new powers over people's lives. So there's a lot of good for lawyers and interesting issues for us to dig into and help people, but we're all trying to learn this new system. And especially with courts and meeting clients and everything, it's become over Zoom a lot of the time for everyone's getting used to this, but we're learning, I think, that we can get a lot of stuff done remotely that we didn't even think about before. And maybe this is changing some of our patterns for the better, so we learn how to work more efficiently and get things done without wasting a lot of time and effort. Now, today is an interesting day because finally the state of California is modifying its stay-at-home order. We've been in this for, I believe, about 7 weeks right now of sheltering in place. I know some lawyers have probably been going out and about to some extent, but most of the lawyers I know have been working from home, doing things remotely. There have been criminal lawyers, still going back and forth to the courts. There's certain functions that are going on with the court system still, but it's sort of just emergency operations that are in the court. And otherwise, people have been appearing mostly by telephone. I've been calling in and appearing on felony cases just over the phone. You never used to really be able to do that. And also sometimes on Zoom web conferences. So it's interesting how the courts are becoming more efficient with the video conferences, the phone calls. They're letting people file documents electronically now. You used to have to bring things physically to the courthouse. So there's a lot of efficiencies. But so what does it look like? What are the new changes to the order as we move forward and get ready to reopen? This next phase that we're going into, you're going to start seeing more retail stores opening up. Currently, most retail stores have been ordered closed except for certain exceptions, but now you're going to start to see more categories, but they have to have only curbside pickup. People are not allowed to go into the stores. Also, a lot of the non-retail sector is going to be eligible to start opening up. You're going to be seeing manufacturing and logistic chains opening up, but there's going to be safeguards put in place and precautions. And with all these new phases of the economy opening up, you're going to be seeing more masked workers, people with gloves. You're going to be seeing things like people paying remotely instead of hand to hand. And you're going to see a lot of hand sanitizer everywhere. And interesting, it's not going to be the whole state changing at once. In Gavin Newsom's announcement of the relaxing of the restrictions, he said there's a lot of room for regional variation. And counties are allowed to move faster than the state as a whole by reopening restaurants and offices at their discretion based on the local conditions. But in order to do that and start opening up more and more, they have to meet certain requirements as certified by the local public health officer and supported by the county board of supervisors and local hospitals and healthcare systems. So there's certain benchmarks they put in place in order to keep reopening. There has to be no more than one COVID-19 case per 10,000 residents, and no COVID-19 deaths in the past 14 days. There's a daily testing volume, testing availability, ability to house homeless residents, et cetera. But there's certain benchmarks that we have in place. I just wanted to go through briefly some slides the state put out that explains these phases that we're going into so everyone can see what to expect. As I mentioned, these are the indicators that the people are looking out for as we open up. These are the trend lines of the hospitals. It looks like the shelter in place has been working. Basically, the idea of this whole system was to avoid overcrowding the hospitals and creating excess deaths from people who can't get medical care. But it's actually, you can see these trend lines look pretty good. The total hospitalized and total ICU has been pretty flat, which has been the goal of this. And the hope is that as we start to open back up, these numbers don't start shooting back up. And if they do, then we might have to start locking down again. But hopefully we can start opening back up without these lines shooting up high in the air. There are certain stages. We're just getting into stage 2 right now of this system. And this is for lower risk workplaces can start opening up. These are the retail curbside, the manufacturing and logistics. And then the later part of stage 2 will be different childcare, other offices, limited hospitality services, personal services. And then stage 3, that's going to be getting more into the large events, movie theaters, religious services, and more personal services. And then stage 4 will be all done and we'll be all out of the lockdown order. So this is stage 2. We're just starting it today, Friday, May 8th. There's certain guidelines they've given for retailers, manufacturers, and warehouses how to operate. And where the idea is we'll gradually move into stage 2 and open up more businesses. We'll see shopping malls, restaurant dining, museums, and offices. Right? Currently, offices are not supposed to be operating unless you're one of the essential services. Now, lawyers, it's kind of interesting. If you're servicing clients who are in one of the essential services industry, that they say that lawyers are allowed to work in their offices because they're supporting the essential businesses. But the vast majority of other office workers out there are not supposed to be going to work. But as we move into stage 2, you'll be able to see more offices opening up. And there's a lot of guidelines and tips that people have given about how to safely operate an office that we'll be getting into a little bit later. But the state's asking people to make sure to train employees, to implement plans, et cetera, to try to minimize the exposure. And this whole lockdown order, this is a result of the original state order from Gavin Newsom back on March 19th that started the whole lockdown. And this is what we've been under ever since. There's been some doubt about whether the constitutionality of Gavin Newsom's order, whether he has the power to lock down the whole state. And you've been seeing some interesting resistance in certain counties opening back up in violation of this order. But it looks like, for the most part, this order is loosening up now. And under this state order, the counties have been able to put in more stringent orders. And we've been seeing that variations in different counties to some extent. The state of California has published some guidance on their website. There's, if you go through on the website for each industry, and if you're advising clients in one of these industries, you can point them to this. But there's, you click on it and then it pulls up, there's a whole kind of guide to tips to how to open up your industry and do it as safely as possible. And that'll be important for employers to take these steps to avoid potential liability for causing exposure and risks, et cetera. Now Allison's going to get into this a little bit. We have the local governments around here have been putting in place different orders. We've had LA County Health Department putting out a guide to reopening. We've seen Beverly Hills has had its own restrictions that they put in place. And then the city of LA has also put in place orders. And under all these local orders, it actually can be a misdemeanor to violate the social distancing guidelines. But so far, we haven't been seeing a whole lot of arrests of people. It's been, thankfully, for the most part, voluntary. So Allison, do you want to get into a little bit of the issues we've seen at the local level?
Yes. So hi, everyone. So as every day, the governor comes on TV almost, and so does our mayor of LA. And one of the themes of this week has actually been really interesting, describing to the public the way that like state and local government operate. So as Raza indicated, there is a state order, but the state is allowing the local governments to make their own orders. And just something to go over, which seems simple, but actually I didn't realize until we started practicing in the area of zoning. But the way it works in terms of LA County, just to explain this, what's LA County versus LA City versus Beverly Hills? So when you talk about, let's say, LA County and what their orders are, those are orders that affect the unincorporated areas of LA County. And then you talk about LA City. LA City is one of the 93 cities in LA County, as is Beverly Hills. So in terms of the jurisdiction of any kind of order, LA County will cover all unincorporated LA County. LA City, just the city of LA. Beverly Hills, just the city of Beverly Hills. So that's just as an introduction. And of course, we understand that there are these orders, but that doesn't really tell us how we're supposed to operate in our day-to-day lives and our law practices. And it also doesn't tell us what our liability is if somebody gets sick. And what we're trying to do in this webinar is talk about kind of the ethical issues that are going to come about. Today, there was an LA Times article, which I'm going to show in just a moment, if I can, that talked about kind of the new normal, which is a very strange situation where people are sitting 6 feet apart. There's no more water cooler life. And then where there's a world where the elevators, you don't push buttons. But then the question is, if you abide by all these things and someone gets sick anyway, what's your responsibility? And number two is, should you even open up if you're allowed to, if it seems like, in your opinion or based on reasonableness, that people still may get sick? So just let me just show you the LA Times article for a moment. That was from today. Here. Unless, Rosa, do you want to pull that up for us? That LA Times article today?
Okay.
Rosa's going to pull that up for us. So then there's another ethical issue that comes in, which is that if you're going to open your workplace, let's say your law office, are you going to have to do this public health surveillance on people? And then there is constitutional, ethical, and just workplace issues with that. So is it worth it to open your office if, in order to go to your office building, for example, you're going to have your temperature taken every day, your staff's going to have their temperature taken every day? And I think this goes into issues of ethics as well as just how we want to work. So here's the article. This is today from the LA Times. And it says, when you finally head back to the office, it's not going to be like you remember it. And kind of like the world in which they imagine is going to involve, it says there's going to be rules about how many people can be in the bathroom at a time. There's going to be potentially like rules about whether you can touch the elevator. There's going to be certain exits and entrances. And I also saw other articles saying that there's going to be intense surveillance by employers. And then that's going to be necessary in order for the employers to make sure no one gets sick. So I think the bigger question is, and especially as law offices and professionals, do we even want to, and here's a picture of how it could look. Rosa, can you go back to that picture? And then there's a question, is it worth it to really work like in a situation where you have to be suited up? Like, now this isn't an example of how someone's working, but I mean, there's people who are cleaning up, but I still think it's kind of an example of how like our workplace could be looking. And then there's the issue is whether or not we want to even be back in the office when we have certain ethical and responsibilities as employers that we may not even be able to fulfill. And when the environment is going to be pretty weird. So I've been thinking a lot about like when we go back to the office, if or when, and is it going to be helpful? Is it better to have a virtual consultation with a client, or is it better to sit 6 feet away from them in a small office with a mask on where they could still get sick? So these are kind of some of the practical issues that we're dealing with. And here's an article about the legal issues. California makes it easier to see workers' comp for coronavirus claims. And this is something that's an issue that we're going to be discussing today, is whose responsibility is it? And when is it the employer's responsibility to take care of these, like when workers get sick, and how do they even know that they're getting sick from the workplace? But this just happened this week. Governor Newsom signed an executive order just Wednesday. It will make it easier for essential workers who can track COVID-19 to obtain workers' compensation benefits. And if you're a law office, I think you have to think really hard as to whether or not you want to reopen now or potentially not into the very far future, when you can be sure that at least there's a vaccine available. And it sounds like a really crazy idea, but at the same time, I don't want to be in a 1,200-foot office space necessarily, with people where people are going to end up getting sick. And then what's going to happen, you could, obviously workers are going to file compensation claims, and you're now responsible for people getting sick. So those are kind of some of the issues that we're going to be dealing with. And I think with that, Jeremy, would you like to open up with your kind of position on what's the landscape right now and the issues that we're dealing with?
Yeah, but before we turn to Jeremy, let me just explain this briefly, this workers' compensation, because I think it's important for employers and for lawyers who are going to have staff. Is that this does this new law that came forward, it creates a rebuttable presumption that an employee's coronavirus-related illness arose out of the course of employment for workers' compensation purposes. And that's important because otherwise it could be impossible to tell where someone gets the symptoms from, and there could be a lot of uncertainty. But this is creating some comfort for people who are going back to work, that if they get sick, wherever it happens, that they can get compensated under the workers' compensation laws. And that'll also avoid extra liability for the employer, because if they get it through this workers' compensation remedy, it's a way to avoid lawsuits against the employer. So this new protection helps basically to qualify. The employee has to either test positive for COVID-19 within 2 weeks after performing work, and then it'll be presumptively compensable by workers' compensation. So that'll give a sort of a form of insurance to people going back to work, that if they get sick, the employer or the employee is not going to be personally on the hook.
And how long does this, and so Raza, does this last for, how long does this last for, forever, or is it?
Well, no, the right now the law, the date of the injury has to go between March 19th to July 5th. So I guess that could always get extended, but at least for this period, as we're all getting back to work, there's this presumption.
And so, would you think, so would it be, Raza, would you advise law offices? I know our position is we're not reopening physically for quite a while, but do you think you would advise other people and other offices to at least wait until July 5th to reopen? If they're, for example, a law office dealing with essential work, something that's not like a grocery store, something that literally has to be open, what would you advise?
Well, right now, this workers' comp protection, it only lasts until July 5th. So it could always get extended, but at least until July 5th, there's this sort of protection under the workers' comp law. After July 5th, I don't think anyone really knows yet where exactly we'll be. It depends on which direction this curve is heading. But at least this workers' comp thing provides protection. So employers will not be on the hook for workers who contract coronavirus, unless it can be shown that the employer is somehow intentionally doing things or something really reckless or that would be outside the scope of normal employment. So you still have to be careful. But I think a lot of people are just realizing how to prioritize what's really, when it's necessary to do an in-person meeting versus remotely, and people are learning that you can do a lot more stuff remotely than previously assumed.
Raza, when you talk about reasonableness, that's an interesting thing, because we have the president of the United States, one level, who rejects the CDC guidelines. And we have the state who puts out industry guidelines. Workers' compensation, though, is that governed by the state or federal government, Raza?
It's under the state workers' compensation system.
So then what kind of standard in terms of reasonableness do you think that an employer should be utilizing in terms of how reasonable their protections are for their workers? What would be the right standard?
So there's a lot of guidance that the CDC, the Federal Center for Disease Control, put out, kind of long guides for each sector about standards to follow. And these were rejected by the Trump administration. They're not going into effect. They were citing religious freedom concerns. Part of it was they tried to regulate religious services, but also economic concerns that maybe some of these regulations would be too expensive and too difficult to put in place. But we've seen.
What should someone do practically? What if a law office? What should they go by? Right,
well, there's still a good resource, the CDC guidelines, as a sort of ideal way to follow, and I think it's worthwhile to follow them, and that would be a good way to avoid liability. Also, the state of California has put out guidance on something called the Resilience Roadmap, where you can go into each industry and get a guidance for how to operate. So I would say that would provide a good sort of safe harbor where if you were going to get sued and you could show that you took steps to implement these guidelines, that would provide a legal protection and also a moral comfort that you're not inflicting unnecessary risks on your employees.
Okay, now it's Jeremy's turn, right?
Great, yeah. So let me
Thank
share.
you, Raza. That was really excellent, by the way, about the workers' comp. Thank you.
So as a disclaimer, I am not an attorney. I am a forensic accountant, and I'm typically retained by attorneys and judges to render testimony and consult on financial and economic issues. And so as part of my section in this presentation, I'm going to be telling you a little about the economic landscape under COVID-19 and how that might affect you and your practice, both today and where we're going into the future. Some of the statistics that I've compiled here show a little bit about what's going on. This was by the Pew Charitable Foundation, conducted in April. You'll see that the statistics on a survey that has been done shows that of adults who had been surveyed, whether they or someone in their household had been laid off or lost their job, out of all of those adults, 28% had responded affirmatively. Out of those same folks, they were asked, had anybody in their house taken a pay cut? 33% of them responded affirmatively. And net, either or both, you're looking at 43% responding affirmatively. That's a staggering number to show that across the US population and the working constituents and citizens, you're looking at about 43% of households has either lost their job or has taken a pay cut. That number jumps dramatically in certain ethnic populations. The African American population jumps to 44%, and the Hispanic population jumps to 61%. So know that when you're practicing in your practices, this is affecting certain demographics more than it is others. Whether your practice is in consumer law or in business law, I'll show you some of the statistics that are affecting various different industries. You'll see also that I've broken this out by age demographic, education, and upper, lower, and middle incomes. And so you'll see that this has affected lower incomes more dramatically than it has the upper income echelons. And it's also affected those folks in the age brackets 49 and below much more than it has affected those citizens 50 and above. The unemployment rates, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, shows that unemployment across all demographics has actually increased between February and March, and we would expect that. And while these statistics are lagged, you'll see that in Caucasian unemployment rates went from 3.1 to 4.0%. African American unemployment rates went from 5.8 to 6.7%. And Asian American unemployment rates went from 2.5 to 4.1%, with Latin American unemployment rates going from 4.1 to 6.0. Now that was as of March of 2020. Those statistics have been staggeringly increased over the course of the last several weeks. A study, while economists don't agree as to what that percentage of unemployment is today, because it's difficult to survey, many economists agree that it's floating somewhere around 16 to 20%. Now that's a staggering number, particularly when we're talking about managing practices for constituents or clients who have lost their jobs. Take a look at the unemployment in at various different industries. Look at these figures to the far left as they're marked in negative. That represents the thousands of jobs that have been lost month over month as of March 2020. You'll see that the hardest hit or most effective industry is naturally leisure and hospitality, losing 459,000 jobs. Right? You're looking at retail losing 46,000 jobs, education and health services losing 76,000 jobs, and professional and business services losing 52,000 jobs. I've stratified some of this data so that you can see the participation in industry by age. And you'll see that accommodation and food services actually are dominated by workers who are 44 and below. So the hardest hit demographic are those folks who are lower educations. We might have naturally thought so. The demographics in accommodations and food services also are being hit very hard, and those age brackets of 40 and below are being hit significantly more difficult. Now, what I want to show here is that the change in median net worth relative to 2007, before the Great Recession in the housing market had hit, still haven't recovered. So in 2010, you'll see between ages, those folks who are less than 40, they had not recovered their net worth. Again, same story with 40 to 61, and same story with those who are 62 and above. And what that suggests is that despite the economic recovery throughout 2010, 13, and 16, where these surveys were done, the economic impact of the Great Recession had not fully recovered yet. And so that propounds and compounds the effects that we're seeing of COVID-19. Further, you'll see the median age of US home ownership jumped from age 31 in 2009 to age 47 in 2019. That was 9 or 10 years or 8 years since the financial crisis. That means that the age demographic still hasn't economically settled down and found its footing. And so what is telling here is that there is afoot warning signs. These warning signs in this economic landscape were already unstable to a certain degree and hadn't found their economic recovery. The IMF warns that the COVID-19 pandemic could trigger a global economic issue comparable to the Great Depression. And so what's interesting to me is that when we take a look at businesses, the business cycle, it's not uncommon to see downturns and recoveries. We've seen that historically. Those are macro shock events. But this one, interestingly, I believe is different because there are these models that economists use to describe recoveries. And let me give you an example of some of those. There's something called a V-shaped recovery. A V-shaped recovery is a sharp decline and then a sharp recovery. We saw that in the crash of 1987. That's where the equities market crashed because of there was Persian Gulf tensions and there was computer trading. There was 5 years of a bullish market. And then immediately in a single day, 23% of the market capitalization of the US economy was wiped out. But immediately after that, we started to see this sort of V-shaped recovery, right? That was a sharp recovery. There's something called a U-shaped recovery, and that is where you sort of see this gradual slow decline and then a protracted slow recovery. We saw that kind of slow decline in the 1990s housing market. That slow decline happened over several years, and then there was oil price issues and overvaluations. Subsequently, you saw a gradual recovery. We call that a U-shaped recovery. There's something called an L-shaped recovery. And an L-shaped recovery is where you see a sharp decline and then a gradual slow recovery. That could be characterized by the housing market and the mortgage market in 2008, where residential prices and subprime loans had exploded, and there was a sharp decline, but sort of a very gradual recovery over the course of the next 10 years. That L-shaped recovery is what we're in now. And interestingly enough, each of those sort of recoveries that and recessions that I described have an impetus. Those are economic impetuses. Here in the COVID-19 landscape, there is no such economic impetus. And so what I believe is going to happen is something called a W-shaped recovery. That is a sharp decline when we see safe-at-home measures retracted back. You'll see a sharp increase or a sharp recovery. But then what will happen, interestingly enough, in history, we've never seen the government respond in such a way to a public health crisis where they're shutting down businesses. They're shutting down not just regions and segments, but entire countries are shut down. The world as a globally is shut down. And so,
Jeremy, how does this compare to like the flu of 1918 in that regard?
So that's interesting, because in 1918, we saw something very similar, but the US economy had not been developed to a certain degree that it is now. And so what we saw was that in 1918, you didn't have the same type of economic stimulus that you have now. And I'll talk about that economic stimulus later on, but you'll see that while there was a dip in the markets, which measures the economics of the US economy, there wasn't this huge amount of influx of economic stimulus by the US government. As many of you folks know, there's the PPP, which was funded over $600 billion. There's the EIDL loans, which were funded over $300 billion, and I'll go over those later. But what that is going to do is sort of propel a sharp increase in the economics. And what it will do is almost artificially prop it up. That is, employers who received some of the stimulus will keep employees because they are required to do so in order for them to get forgiveness from their loans.
And Jeremy, I know you're going to get into more later, but how would you compare like the New Deal legislation? And funny enough, all the New Deal legislation all was like by acronyms, which is funny, right? Like we have all these, the PPP idea, that's how it was also then.
Yeah.
And can you compare to us like the nature of the New Deal economic things they did then versus now? Like kind of like, you know, and how do those compare, like the nature of those reforms?
Well, some of those reforms under today's economic stimulus, those monies are being pushed directly to consumers and small businesses. That we haven't seen. So you'll see, and we'll talk about this later, but you'll see that there are monies going directly to consumers. $1,200 for those folks who are making $75,000 or less. $2,400 to those families who are married, filing jointly, and making $200,000 or less, and $500 per child within those families. And so it's going straight to the consumer. You're also seeing stimulus that's happening not just for big businesses with 500 employees or more, but for smaller businesses. And that we hadn't seen before. The amount of economic stimulus that's going back into the economy is a staggering amount of money that's going to prop it up. Now, from the economics of it, what I was saying is that's going to prop up the market artificially, because there's going to be business owners who are going to retain employees, not because of the necessity in the economics of the business, but because they want the monies that are given as a form of stimulus to be forgiven. there's a component of forgiveness of debt. And so once that happens, you might see again sort of a double dip recession, and then have to come back into a recovery. So,
Jeremy, could you talk a little bit about the PPP and whether it's available to lawyers, or whether you're part of a law firm or whether you're self-employed?
yeah, absolutely. So there's another section that I have here, and you folks will get that in your materials. There's a whole alphabet soup of various different economic stimuli. The PPP is probably the most popular that you've heard, and that's the Paycheck Protection.
And also, Jeremy, can you address this while you're discussing this? When I looked today at the EIDL, it says it's like only open right now to agriculture. Which was kind of, I didn't realize it was only open to that right now.
So the PPP is the Paycheck Protection Program. It was originally allocated $349 billion. It's now been allocated an additional $310 billion. And what this is a loan forgiveness. It's fully forgiven if funds are used for payroll, interest on mortgages, not the principal, rent, and utilities. So 75% of that has to go to payroll directly. The 25% can go to those other expenses. But those payments.
Wait, Jeremy, one quick question. Does that mean like the owner, this is something I'm confused about. Can that go to like my mortgage, my personal? Okay, two things. One is to the owner of the business is use that for their personal mortgage, if that's not their place of business. And two, what if their house has become their place of business due to the coronavirus? Can you do anything with that portion?
That's a good question. What I would say, and without giving you specific findings, because the regulations describing how to deal with this are not out. But if you have a lease agreement, that lease agreement would typically allow for the business to take a lease expense or a rent expense. Now, to the extent that it's happening in your personal home,
due to the coronavirus, like now, let's say both like, we're working out of our house now. So we still have our rent obligation, but can we use any of it also for our mortgage?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So first of all, to be clear, if you're using your home as a home office, you're allowed to do so both from a taxation perspective and also from an operations perspective. Document that, make sure that there's lease agreements so that when the PPP loans get audited, you have documentation to assert that you have a legitimate lease agreement to pay for the lease. That's money's going from the business to the owner of the property, okay? Now, your other question was, can the PPP be used in order to pay your own personal mortgage? And typically the answer is no, but there may be some ways to work around that. So in law firms, typically law firms are established as LPs or LLPs, and partners are receiving K1s. But to the extent that the PPP has been established, it has been established in order to pay for payroll, that is W-2, and subcontractors and independent contractors, 1099s. But as it stands now, partners who are taking it in the form of K1s are going to have a hard time getting the PPP. So what I oftentimes recommend is take that and move it into either wages and salary or 1099s and talk to your tax practitioner about that as well.
So just on that note, I wanted to just add something. So like, let's say you have an example. This happened in our office where you eliminated people due to the coronavirus or in that time period, and they got new jobs and you don't want to work with them anymore. But maybe you as the boss, you were taking draws and now you can go on payroll up to 100,000. So is that right? Like, can you replace, if you have an employee who left, can you replace that employee with, let's say, put yourself on payroll under 100, and then get the forgiveness also? Is there room to maneuver in that way?
Yeah, so there is room to maneuver in that way. Putting yourself on payroll is one way to do that. So getting a paycheck, putting yourself through payroll. Now, there is other implications that you should be talking to your tax advisor about as well, because wages and salary are taxed differently than K1 guaranteed payments and ordinary income. So there may be a higher tax associated with the monies that you're receiving as a W-2. There may be some restrictions associated with that if you're a partner in the practice and they don't have the provision to allow for you to receive W-2 income. And so those are sort of the considerations that you'll have to look through. But the answer is yes, if you receive now, assuming that you're able to do so and you receive wages and salary, that would be covered under your PPP. And then you could use your wages and salary to pay for your mortgage. That's one way to get around that. Okay, so the PPP, by the way, is a maximum of 2.5 times your average monthly payroll costs over the last 12 months, or $10 million, whichever is lower. So when it comes to those folks who are self-employed, those self-employed folks would be reporting on a Schedule C on their tax returns, or a single member LLC, which flows through to your tax return. In those situations, you would also be able to avail of that because you're receiving monies that are subject to self-employment taxes and self-employment income.
Hey, Jeremy, one question on that. So, and this seems, I've heard it two different ways. Let's say that when you're calculating your PPP, there seems to be a debate on whether or not you can include the partner draw, if not on payroll. And can you? What's your opinion on that? And if you weren't on payroll at the time, and can you go back and add it in later on if you didn't do it that way? Those are two questions.
Well, so if your application is in and you've received the PPP, you can only ever have one PPP loan. So
okay.
You're out of luck. Now, banks have gotten all sorts of changes to the PPP program. So by way of example, before you could include within the amount of payroll the subcontractors that you had paid out, and that would have been included. That then was revoked and then put back into place by April 13th. And so depending on your bank, you should be utilizing your bank and what their internal metrics are, because some banks have accepted the fact that attorneys were receiving K-1s and included that into payroll, because into perpetuity or into the near future, they would be receiving that income as W-2. Some banks have denied that, and some banks were initially denying 1099s and then subsequently included them. So from a prudent perspective, I would say if you haven't applied for the PPP yet, include that income, the K-1 income and your 1099 income, and then your bank will tell you whether or not they will accept that, okay? So some people also have asked about the taxability of the PPP. As it stands now, the CARES Act has a provision that says that the forgiveness of the debt associated with the PPP is not taxable income. So at the same time, which is intuitive, guidance has come down that's non-authoritative, that essentially says that the payments that you make or the expenses that you pay with the PPP forgiven funds would not be tax deductible, which makes sense. If it's not taxable, then it won't be tax deductible. So I often encourage folks to make sure that to the extent they receive these funds and act accordingly in order to have them forgiven, that they be put into a separate bank account and accounted for separately. Okay, so make sure that you're talking to your controller, your bookkeeper, your financial executive to make sure that they understand to separate these funds, because they will be treated differently for purposes of forgiveness. They'll be treated differently for purposes of taxation, and treated differently when you're making the payments towards expenses. Okay. So I want to talk about also the economic injury and disaster loan. Initially, it was funded.
Tell us what's the deal with that, Jeremy, today with this? It's agriculture only, it says on the website right now. What's the story with that?
So that story was broken yesterday, and it effectively it cuts out virtually everybody out of this loan.
Except one very important industry that we like to advise in, which is the hemp industry.
The hemp industry
which is now specifically allowed, and apparently only that and in agriculture is allowed right now. Is that right?
That's correct. So the economic injury and disaster loan is called the EIDL loan. It was up until yesterday available to all small businesses with 500 employees or less. It was funded with $562 billion, and subsequently in late April got an additional $60 billion in funding. This is the loan that has a $10,000 grant associated with it. If you qualified for it, you would have received $10,000 as a grant. That's not, you don't pay that back.
Well, by the way, that's like kind of weird though, because sometimes people, sometimes you get like 5,000 or 6,000. It's supposed to be 10.
So we don't know why that is. And we've heard people reporting that they've received 5,000, 7,500, et cetera. We don't know why, but there was essentially $10,000 that was supposed to be an upfront grant, not to the extent repaid. The remainder of it would have been repaid over 30-year amortization at 3.75% if you were a for-profit business, or 2.75% if you were a nonprofit. As of yesterday, news had broken that said that the maximum loan amount had gone down to $150,000 and is now available only to agricultural businesses, which is a huge step down.
But Jeremy, if you applied before, which like many of us applied before and we've only gotten the small portion, do the old rules apply to us? So if we applied before yesterday and we're still...
It's likely that the old rules apply to you if you had applied and you got your SBA E-Tran number, which is which is where you are basically in your place in line to receive those funds. Okay, so I mean it's a great loan if you had put in the application already. 30-year amortization on a business loan is sort of unheard of unless you had some real property you could tie to it. But it's a great loan to be able to get there. It's basically a SBA 7A loan with really good terms.
And then for the PPP, just to be clear though, that one still is open. Lawyers who haven't applied are encouraged to. And something that most people don't know, but our bank actually told us, is that Square and PayPal are also processing them. They have $60 billion set aside for small businesses. And you can apply it through your bank and through Square, and then whoever gets it to you first, that's totally allowed. That's what we did. And the thing that's good about that is like, it's not like you have to wait to call back with like you don't have to, go through a whole thing talking on the phone to a banker. And the kind of discrimination that occurs in banks against people who don't have the biggest accounts doesn't occur in that context. So anybody who wants to also apply for their business through Square or PayPal, you can go online and do that for the PPP, and you can still do it.
Yeah, and my suggestion is that you identify SBA approved lenders that specialize in that. Avoid the larger banks. Wells Fargo closed off all applications and they basically let their small to medium-sized businesses down.
Hey, Jeremy, we have this question from the audience. This is something I was wondering myself. This is from Sandra Salinas. She says, do you think employers will be able to modify their payroll schedule to allow an additional payroll during the 8 weeks? For example, if one's payroll is the 15th and 30th and your 8 week ends 2 days before that, can you issue payroll on the 28th?
So the answer is that and hi, Sandy. Glad to see you on the webinar. The answer is that the PPP does not delineate how or when you run that payroll, but it does say that you have to get back up to full-time employment by July 15th. And so if you have to modify payroll times or run more payroll or less payroll, then in order to meet the requirements, then PPP itself doesn't put any restrictions on having to do so. My suggestion is that you look at your payroll schedule or your calendar to make sure that you meet the requirements to get back up to full-time employment by the deadline.
So then, Jeremy, can I ask you this? Could you let's say you have an employee who makes 80, but can you put in 3 payrolls so that you can make let's say you don't want to you know, can you put in several payrolls so that you're increasing yourself back up to that, or is that allowed?
So yeah, when you say an employee who makes 80, you should know that when we were talking about the PPP, you should exclude from your calculation of average monthly payroll any compensation in excess of $100,000 per employee, and
Right.
then that's what gets awarded to you. So it's a good distinguishment that you use that term, that number, 80,000.
That's why, yeah, and that's why I'm saying, like, I was thinking, can we get everyone back and kind of you make everyone get up to 100 by doing multiple payrolls, you know, or less than 100, like the rules talk about during those 8 weeks.
Right. Well, so what would happen is it gets annualized, and those
Oh,
regulations, while aren't clear, it's probably likely that you'll take that payroll, annualize it, make sure that that payroll expense hasn't gone, you know, beyond that $100,000, and only the amount that's under $100,000 will have the forgiveness associated with it.
well, would it be wrong to like increase someone to, let's say, 99,000 for 2 months so that you can put more of their and then reduce them later on, and so that you can kind of put more of their salary into the payroll protection?
Right. So you could do something
Okay.
like that. Well, yeah. So to the extent that somebody was at 80 and now you're bringing them up to 99, you could do that. But you should also know that that would affect your operations. It would also affect the way that you negotiate payroll into the future. You know, setting a standard where you're trying to meet the requirements of the SBA and forgiveness would then put you in a position where you have to negotiate payroll into the future and say, well, now we're taking it back down from 99. I think the better way to do that is likely to take on somebody, you know, somebody new who's a paralegal or a secretary or something to that effect, so that you can get up to the amount of spending that you need under the PPP.
Right. Okay.
If you see how this kind of thing, this kind of, for lack of a better term, I'll call it gamesmanship in order to meet the requirements, is going to prop up the economy in a way that is sort of manufactured. You know, we're going to be spending money running our firms, not because this is the prudent thing to do, but because it is the way for us to get loan forgiveness from the PPP.
Well, do you think, well, Jeremy, speaking of which, and I know we have a lot more to go, but since we're on this, I think these are all like questions that people want to have answered. What would you propose then, because it's like this, that people also consider, like, there's no reason to have to like get the loan forgiveness for everything. The loan for the PPP is only 1%. It's payable back in 2 years, and maybe the best thing to do is to keep things as they are. I mean, put yourself on payroll, obviously, otherwise, and just pay back the money at 1%, because we don't know what's going to happen. Because one thing that I've been going back and forth over is that if, like, let's say we do this for 2 weeks, in order to go back to like what our old payroll is, you have to have the gross income, or else you're not going to sustain it. And
Sure.
I think that people need to, like, what I'm trying to do is just like literally take it 2 weeks at a time. Put,
Right.
you know, increase it back, and then and then also maybe consider spending some of the money on, you can spend on advertising and pay it back later,
Right.
that type of thing, and do
That's a
things to
great
get your
point.
business back together.
That's a great point. So what I typically advise our firms that we are consulting for is, to the extent that you have collections, use those collections for the expenditures that are non-forgivable. Advertising, marketing, sales, infrastructure, systems, etc. Right? Use that for those things. And then for the amounts that are forgivable, payroll, rent, utilities, use the PPP. Because while the financing associated with the PPP is 1%, it's also a forgiveness of the principal. So let me give you some round figures. Let's say that you got $150,000 and you used all of that on non-forgivable expenditures. Well, 1% of that is only $1,500. That's minuscule in the greater extent. But the $150,000 of principal is really what you're looking at, really, because that $150,000 is what could be forgiven if you account for it and spend it appropriately, meeting the requirements of the SBA.
Well, Rosa, do you want to do like a few minute summary of the last, kind of our remaining, well, kind of the end of the COVID law. I know and everyone, there's a bunch on our website, more to go over, but Rosa, maybe you can just give a little preview of the rest of what our materials might be.
Well, I thought we could just briefly go over the court rules for people who are still practicing in court. There's some interesting ones that have affected.
And Rosa, real quick, does it mean if you're practicing in court, does that mean you're essential? So I was just looking again at that definition. So in California, just to be clear, just because you're a lawyer doesn't make you essential. You have to be dealing with those infrastructure industries, and I know that even this came up in federal court over there was some lawyers saying that they should be able to prepare together, and they said, no, you're not sufficiently critical. So Rosa, can you just address that too?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. What is considered essential? I think it's clear that if you're servicing clients who are in one of the essential industries, you're allowed to go to work and so forth. And it would be the same for going into the court system. If you have clients who are going to court for one of those designated tasks, you're allowed to go there. And I think this is one of the rules where it's not really going to be enforced so much against lawyers. Jeremy, do you mind stop sharing your screen so I can pull up something on mine? We've been seeing so one thing we've been seeing is a lot of law firms have been laying off people. People have been more working remotely. But there has been some litigation over what exactly qualifies as essential and who's allowed to go out and who's not. There was an interesting case out of the Sixth Circuit. I won't get into it in detail, but it was deciding whether the ban on all religious services is unconstitutional, violates the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, especially since they were allowing liquor stores to remain open. They were called life affirming, but churches were not. There was controversy in New York where the mayor was seen as targeting Jewish residents who are congregating for, I believe, funerals, but they were getting called out, and there was some question over whether that was sort of religious targeting. There's over Zoom, some people have been doing religious services over Zoom, but obviously some religious Jewish people aren't able to use Zoom or electronics on Fridays. So there's been a lot of litigation or questions over what's really considered essential and what's not. But lawyers are allowed to work. They're allowed to go to court for the essential types of hearings. There's new procedures in place allowing lawyers to call in remotely, to file things remotely. It'll be interesting to see whether people start doing jury trials over electronic conference. There's a right under the Constitution to confront our witnesses and our accusers and to do cross-examination, and that's not quite the same over Zoom, where you're not able to see demeanor and so forth. So a lot of interesting issues dealing with the practice of law. And I see we've hit the 1 hour mark. One other quick issue that's come up in New York. There's some articles coming out about how they've been targeting racial minorities and poor people, basically under the enforcement of these social distancing rules. They arrested 40 people in New York, only one of whom was white, for the social distancing violations. There's reports of officers, physically attacking people who are not social distancing, and then arresting them, taking them into jails, exposing a lot more people. So as usual, just like with the war on drugs, these types of laws end up impacting the poor and the minorities the hardest. So I think we'll have to think about how we continue to enforce these and how lawyers can maybe step in and help people when their rights are being violated. And that includes the people who are in jails and prisons, a lot of whom have been released lately under programs dealing with COVID-19.
Well, thank you, everyone. You guys can go to our materials. Blake in the audience. Yeah, on my website, on margolinlawrence.com, if you go to webinar notes, you can find this. And then, of course, the Beverly Bar will post this later and send this out, but it's margolinlawrence. I'm writing it up for you guys.com /webinar-notes. And we try to put up also some of the emergency rules that we covered in our previous webinar. And if you guys have any questions, you guys can obviously feel free to call myself and Raza. Our number's on our website, but we have an answering service 24 hours, and we're staying home working, so we're very available if you guys have any questions. And Jeremy, of course, is available to help you guys if you need to prepare your PPPs. He's doing a lot of last minute preparation of people's P&L statements, their 2018 taxes, and anything else that they need to do for the PPPs. And Howard, thank you for helping us, and Alex as well. And thanks everyone for attending.